Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are coming to you in a kind of hybrid fashion tonight. So my name is John. I am the exhibition and retail coordinator at Street Level Photoworks, and we'll be joined by Victoria Clare Bernie, who's going to give us a guided tour of our exhibition Slow Water, which is on at the Harbour Arts Centre until the 18th of September. So if you've not managed to get out to the Harbour Arts Centre, please do try and get along if you can. And for those who are maybe a little bit further away or won't be able to make it, you can also view a 3D rendition of the exhibition on our website as well, and I'll share the link with that. As I say, tonight, Victoria is going to give us a guided tour of the exhibition, and then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for audience questions and comments. So please do feel free to post anything that you might want to ask Victoria. Post that into the chat, and there'll be time for questions at the end. So yeah, I'm going to hand it over to Victoria just now for a guided tour of our exhibition. See you in a little bit.
Slow Water at the Harbour Arts Centre is a sampling of a body of work that was produced in a residency, an artist residency at SAMS, which is a marine lab just a little to the east of Oban on Loch Etive, which is one of the biggest sea lochs in Scotland, and it has the biggest catchment area of fresh water coming into it. The scientists who work at the lab work all over the world. They work in Scotland, and it has the biggest catchment area of fresh water coming into it. The scientists who work at the lab work all over the world. They work in Scotland, and it has the biggest catchment area of fresh water coming into it. The scientists who work at the lab work all over the world. They work in Scotland, and it has the biggest catchment area of fresh water coming into it. And the reason scientists who work at the lab work all over the world in Scotland, and it has the biggest catchment area of fresh water coming into it. And the reason scientists who work at the lab work all over being able to spend time to dwell on a day-to-day basis to watch the seasons change. The scientists there were very generous, and they invited me to work with two specific fields of interest. What I'd like to do in taking you around the exhibition is to just pull out some of the connections that those scientists made between what I'm interested in as a visual artist and what they look at with a completely different eye as scientists, and also introduce you to the two poles of my practice, the two extremes of my practice. So I'd like to begin with this piece of work here, which is called Our Friends and Neighbours. It's a series of photographs of the tiniest possible creatures. These are many of them are a little bit smaller than my baby fingernail. They are bottom feeders in that they exist in the silt at the bottom of the sea, usually within the coastal shelf, which is the area before you slip off into the really deep sea. And they do a lot of work on our behalf. The reason I want to talk about them a little bit is because they follow one particular way in which my practice works, which is a very deep enthusiasm for finding things out, for asking questions, and finding out the knowledge of other people who are specialists in subjects I simply don't understand. So this is really the work of Dr. Heinrich Stahl, who is a biogeochemist. And these creatures are amongst, there are many of them, are amongst some of the findings from a key piece of work in the exhibition, which is called Callunas, which is a film that I'll be speaking about and talking to a little bit later on. The particular critter I would like to introduce you to is the brittle star, which is this one up here. The work that Henrik undertakes is interested in the ways in which carbon and oxygen behave in the marine landscape. He picks Loch Etive because Loch Etive, as I said, a lot of fresh water coming in. Also in its bathymetry, which is its contours, it has two sills. One is the Falls of Laura, which is where the bottom surface of the sea loch dips suddenly and becomes deep sea. And at Aird's Point, it does the same. So these were collected at Aird's Point, which is treating a sea loch or a fjord like a laboratory. The brittle star behaves in a particularly productive way in terms of our possible futures, in that it exists just in the line of the silt on the seabed. He'll never forgive me for calling it the seabed, he called it something else. This little creature will eat carbon and it will excrete oxygen, which can only be beneficial for us. What Henrik's work did was to study the behaviours of everything at these minute scales, things that are smaller than this as well, things called single-cell organisms. And he would use that to develop an extraordinary three-dimensional understanding of what to look for when he went out in the oceans, because most of his work was in the deep sea. So the watery coasts of Scotland were his extended laboratory. So that's one aspect of the way that I work. I work really trying to find out and understand something I have no business trying to understand. And in particular, something that relates to water, which is the primary obsession of Slow Water, which is, as I said, in this exhibition and in every other version of this work that's ever been shown, it is sampling from a pretty extraordinary body of work, by which I mean drawings and photographs and films and texts. I'd like to move over now to the other pole of the way that I think and make, or perhaps the world of my creative thinking is the best way to think about it. And this is an image called Ilas Orcadas, and it's a photograph of a ditch. I spend a lot of my life in ditches. I intend to walk very long distances and cover huge swathes and tracts of ground. And I almost always, within an hour, get caught in a ditch with my trousers rolled off, making a film or taking a photograph. This is one of those conditions. In the foreground, there is a drawing, and that drawing is the contours of Loch Horn. The underwater contours are called the bathymetry. It's the contours of Loch Horn. Ilas Orcadas is a seamount, or it's the seamount is an underwater hill that when the waves come down you see it, so it has a presence, and anybody navigating a ship has to keep an eye on them. And the reason I'm talking about this in relationship to our friends and neighbours and that the hard science that happens there is because this is just strange. Apparently the Ilas Orcadas are actually a computer error. When you map the seafloor, you use software, and that software gives a value to the thing that it recognises or it touches upon. The software that discovered this and allowed this seamount to exist as a landscape for some time gave a value to 0. So when it saw nothing, it said it saw something, which ended up being a landmass of this kind. So my work operates between a fascination with science and detail and the knowledge of others, really, and a perverse delight in strange stories that seem to fall in front of me if I keep my mouth shut for long enough in the company of extraordinary people. And that's what I managed to do for quite a lot of the time when I was working at the Marine Laboratory. This ditch is in the edges of Glashan, which is above Loch Gilphead, and is the site of a hydroelectric, part of a hydroelectric scheme. It's a reservoir with all the details, the architectures that attend upon a reservoir in Scotland, this remarkable landscape of hydroelectricity. So Slow Water was motivated by a desire to try and understand the way that water operates in Scotland across every single scale. And that was the motivation for getting the residency, and the motivation for making connections with marine scientists, which is this work here, and freshwater scientists. I worked with people at salmon traps, and I worked with different agencies and companies that own the hydro across Scotland. In the days before 9/11, I used to wander all over the hills, over fences, in and out of all of this infrastructure. But after 9/11, major infrastructure was much more controlled and watched because it's obviously a target for things. So I set up a set of conversations which led to me being able to work not inside the buildings because I have little or no interest in the inside of them, but to be able to move around them with permission and to meet people whose families, they'd worked there, their fathers probably had either come from Ireland or Poland and done the digging They were the navvies who built the hydro. And these men, because it was always men, would tell me the stories of these places. So this is, as I mentioned, this is Glashan. So perhaps to explain my year was just don't stop working. Go wherever you need to go. It was the first time in more than a decade and a half when I had complete permission to travel anywhere on any day, and I would go to the hydro and stitch those in between the cruises and the journeys that I would make with the scientists or the conversations I would have with the scientists. So hydro was one aspect of the work, and the work of our friends and neighbours and Callunas and going on scientific cruises was the other aspect of the work. So moving over to the hydro, this gives you a sense of one of the hydroelectric infrastructures I was looking at. In my early research, I found out, or tried to understand, the way that glacier had moved across Scotland. So, this may be horribly wrong, my understanding is that Rannochmore, the mathematical centre of Scotland, is also the place where a massive great glacier started heading westward. And that's the thing that scours out the lace work of all the sea lochs, Tayvallich, all those places all the way along the west coast that you see that have this extraordinary in and out, which is not happening on the east coast. That's because of the movement of this glacier. Rannochmore is drenched with water. It is one of the places which has been dammed. So from Rannoch you can take a line that for the hydroelectric, you can take a line that goes from Rannoch to Gower to Dunalister to Cluny to Pitlochry. And that will provide energy for large amounts of the UK entire. And then this here is another one of these threads. I started following the seam of the way a catchment would work. This is, by the way, another part of the way that I work is to study old film footage. So I spent a great deal of time in Hillingdon, which is where the Scottish Screen Archive used to be. It's now called the Moving Image Archive, and it's now at Kelvin Hall, but I used to lock myself up in this industrial estate for days on end looking at 1930s and 40s footage of building the hydro. And that prompted a lot of the ways in which I have made the films and a lot of the places I went to. This is Coich, and this is the Tom Doon Road, which is a road. This is a road that ends, which is another favourite thing. It's the road that goes from Spearnbridge to Lochhorn, and at Lochhorn you run out of road, and if you want to go any further, you walk to Barrisdale, and then you walk into Knoydart, which is the most isolated part of mainland Britain. This follows from the dam, which is the Rubble Dam at Coich. This is the release. Every now and again you have to press a button and let the water out. And this follows through the landscape, which every now and again has these moments of infrastructure. The more I worked on this body of the work, the more I understood how touched the landscapes of Scotland are. I came into looking at them years ago with the sort of intoxicated eye of delight. But fairly quickly, and with some brisk conversations with people telling me better than I knew, I realised that pretty much everything has been touched or changed or altered, and we're actually talking about a massive industrial landscape. We're not talking about a wilderness at all. So you can see that slightly in some of the little pylons that are connecting the electricity across otherwise bare hillsides. There are two films in this sampling of slow water, and they cover the two extreme conditions of water in Scotland. One of them's the maritime salt water, which is what this film is that we're seeing now, which is called Callunas, which is the Gaelic for spinning or weaving or industry. And the other film, which I'll talk about in a little while, is called Hydro, which is a collage film that brings together footage taken over the course of a year in the landscape in different climates and across this network of hydroelectric infrastructure. So Callunas is the story of the scientific cruise. Cruise always implies sun lounges, but really these scientists work incredibly hard. It's almost like a ballet, watching them move around things. So this cruise is an exercise in trying out equipment before going to the deep sea. What I'm looking at the moment is the first morning of filming, which was about 3 days after I'd arrived on site and met everybody, and just moved straight into just collecting footage and listening and paying attention. And maybe that's a key element of the way that my practice operates, in that I work with so many different people with fascinating backstories and histories and bodies of knowledge that are new to me. And I spend a lot of my time paying attention, and whether that's paying attention with the camera on or off or through drawing, just sitting and listening. So what they're doing is they are getting all the equipment on board the vessel. The vessel will go out to Aids Bay, which I mentioned earlier is one of these underwater cliffs in the Sea Loch, which is a fjord, and they set up to sample the materials, the conditions of what's happening in the water. So our friends and neighbours is one of the things that they would have sampled, and as you watch the film you'll be able to see there's a point quite a long way in where you see two scientists pulling out large test tubes filled with mud. These test tubes arrive on the seabed, the loch bed, the night before. The movement of the water over the course of 24 hours causes mud to collect, sediment to collect, and critters, which is the critters that I discussed at the beginning, including the brittle star. And that is one of the things that they sample. And when they take those critters out and they measure them and they study them and they document them, they begin to see their capacity, specifically in this work, for changing carbon into oxygen, which is what we're pretty much grateful for them doing. The other things that they collect on this cruise, and you'll see this in some of the delicate machinery, the machinery that they put in the water is called a lander, and you'll see this when you watch any NASA footage. They use landers in space as well. These are exoskeleton scaffolds which hold an instrument. So if you're going to a rough terrain under the water or on Mars, you cannot be sure of what the topography is going to be like, but you want to have a stable condition for your instrument to be able to take a reading. So these, you see it in the footage there, have adjustable legs. So they're whatever 4 is for a tripod, that's what they are. They can put out a number of legs to stabilize the equipment. And the equipment that you'll see there is, one of them is a syringe that will just momentarily take water from the moving current, and another is a set of syringes which will at specific times take up water that can be aligned with a particular moment on the clock, and that will allow them to analyse how much oxygen is in the water. So they're getting this whole picture of the ways in which oxygen are moving. And that really is the science part of what they're doing. And for me as an artist, it is that fascination. I've expressed that. I want to know these things because I want to know my subject, because my subject is the landscape, and I feel a responsibility. I'm really happy to have a responsibility to try and understand it. But the other part is the strange and the beautiful. And what these people do, and probably what they're not particularly able to be valued for, is to move beautifully on board a boat, tying ropes and threading things, hence the name Callunas, spinning and weaving. See people who've been fishermen, or that, they might have started being fishermen at 15 or 14. They've moved on from that to be employed by a scientific laboratory, yet you still see this, it's not innate, it's learned, set of remarkable dexterities. They can pick the right rope, they can tie the right rope, and they never say anything about it. There's rarely anything, apart from maybe once in a while duck, is said on these cruises. It's a very quiet dance of, on one side, the scientists gathering the information and trying to keep an eye on everything so that there is no aberrant, unusual behaviour which will throw off the results. And on the other side is a bunch of sailors who just know what they're doing and move across the boat as if they're in another time system from the rest of us. What they allowed me to do, and what health and safety requires me to do, is to be elevated from them. So a lot of my footage is looking down on them because I had to be out of the way of all the different kinds of machinery that they were working with. So really this is documentary as art. It is landscape art, and it is also an inquiry into the nature of the sea water landscape of Scotland. I've spoken a lot about the work with Henrik Stahl and the particular science that he performs and investigates, and the work that came from that. And I have spoken a little bit about map making, about moving through the landscape. There's a tiny bit of a map in the Orcadas. That was another part of the work, was the fact that this marine lab owns remarkable maritime charts and bathymetric underwater contour information. And I'm a draftsman. I draw a great deal. And I became fascinated with the idea of being able to draw maps myself. So I set about drawing maps of the places that I'd been to. And what I'd like to look at now is Bloomscape, which is the outworking of that interest in cartography because of the marine maps they use to navigate these cruises, but also because of the remarkable collections they have at the Marine Laboratory in their libraries and archive. So I'm moving across to Bloomscape. So this is one of a series of photographic drawings. It is essentially a photograph which I have applied or drawn through with a digital pen. And what I've drawn through it is a cartography. It's a map of another landscape. It's called Bloomscape, which is a reference to Bloom, a character in James Joyce's book Ulysses. A long time ago, my brother, when he heard that I was fascinated with water, he'd read Ulysses, I've never read it, advised me to look at one chapter which is called Ithaca, and it describes the main character, Bloom, in his attic in Dublin, turning on a tap at his kitchen to make himself a pot of tea. And as he turns on the tap, he starts to think about the water coming from the tap and where that water came from. And he moves in scale from the water in the tap to the water in the river, to the water in the reservoir, to the water in the deepest trenches of the ocean, which at that time was the Sundam Trench, all the way back again to the slightly stale flower water sitting in the sunlight on his table in his garret. And it's that world of scales that was operating in my mind when I started to make this drawing, and then a series of other drawings which were all maps of places that I'd been to. One of the things that this connects back to Our Friends and Neighbours, and it's an underplay of, I suppose, the guddle of this residency, because it was never a residency that was designed to deliver one particular thing. It was permission to think differently in another world of thought and to do different things. One of the things was the scientists were really generous with their imagery, but they were also generous with the tools that they used. So in this instance, they introduced me to something called ArcGIS, which is three-dimensional landscape modeling, which in 2008-9 was not available to the general public. It's a bit more available now than it was then. But the places that I had stumbled across, got lost in, or made my way to in the year that I was working at the Marine Laboratory, I could move through the fine lines of their cartography on a computer screen, and I'd never seen anything like it. It's quite an ugly medium, I have to say, because the line weight, it has no line weight qualities, but it is an at the time it was a revelation to be able to fly through landscapes which took me hours to walk or drive. So the imagery is mundane. It's a surface of moving water up close. But the map beneath it, running from right to left, is the journey of water that I described earlier that moves from Rannoch down Loch Etive, through along Loch Etive, the falls of the Aird Point, the falls of Laura, under the bridge, out to the bay at Oban, and the last island, Kerrera, before you get out into slightly more open sea, and Mull and beyond. So really, it's part of the language of the play of scale that runs through all this work. Sometimes I'm describing a whole landscape entirely, and sometimes I am describing a tiny little moment in a ditch. So the drawing that runs underneath here is massive, but the surfaces that it's drawn into are minute and slightly banal. What I'd like to do now is to finish by talking about the second film that's on show in this collection of work, and that's called the Hydro. Hydro is a film collage of a year spent moving through different parts of the Scottish hydroelectric complex, which is a series of reservoirs and concrete installations, vast palaces. It's Tolkien-esque in its scale. You either cry out on seeing it on a hill walk because it has reminded you of humans and you'd forgot them, or if you're like me, you find these fascinating, massive infrastructural moments completely intoxicating. The image behind me is actually the underlie. This is another one of these cartographic drawings, and this is the map of the Tom Doon Road that's drawn into it. But the underlying photograph is from Glashan, and Glashan is a low-level reservoir which is immediately above Loch Gilphead. The opening shots of Hydro start there in the winter, at the point where the water is coming down into streams that channel off the outsourcing outflows. There's a film that was made by Paul Rother, who's a very famous documentary filmmaker, in about 1944 called Power from the Glens, and it is made by Pathé for the British government because they realised that a lot of people who had grown up in the Highlands and the Islands and had been in the services in the Second World War had seen the possibility of another life, and they didn't want to come back to a life where maybe they had a peat fire and they had no heating, and all the white goods that were being available to people in the cities were not available to them. And there was a massive threat to the population of the Highlands and Islands for moves to Australia and Canada. And so a key move on the part of the Labour government was to create a power source that would bring electricity to the Glens. So this film is a fictionalised story of an engineer standing on a hill and looking out across all these other hills. And because he's an engineer and he understands water, he is projecting out the lines which explain how the water will move across the landscape in order to make dams which will create power. And that has been a pivotal film for me, making the work of Hydro, which is, again, it's a series of different places across Scotland, across Highland Scotland, that are different kinds of dam hydro installations. So it moves through the year. It starts in winter and it moves across the surfaces of concrete, watching falling water, watching the insects that gather at the edges of things. There's always something that can distract you from the main narrative, but it is really a hypnotic human waterfall that is playing out across hundreds of miles. Thank you very much for coming to see the work at the Harbour Arts Centre. I'm really pleased to have it exhibited here with the work of my colleagues Coulson and Tennant, and to be part of the bigger story of Everything Flows. I think it's an important exhibition, it's timely, and it's threaded along the southern part of the western coast of Scotland, which is an extraordinary maritime landscape, and one that I have spent a long time in and hope to spend a long time in the future, making work.
Thank you so much, Victoria. That was wonderful. And you've managed to transport yourself in a matter of seconds from Irvine to your studio in Edinburgh. So for those watching at home, I was really lucky to spend a bit of time with Victoria over in the Harbour Arts Centre last week. where we recorded that tour, and it's been great kind of watching it back and been given sort of time to think about some of the things that you spoke about in that. One of the things that kind of jumped out to me just when you were talking through the work was you mentioned the the scientist acting almost like a ballet, and that idea of this kind of ballet of science seems like a really apt metaphor for your approach and the outcomes of that work. And I was kind of curious to know, for you when you were there, what was the order in which the work kind of evolved for you? Did it start as photographs? Did it start as drawings? Did it, because the kind of overlaying and the mixing of different approaches is really interesting.
Actually, it was driven very much by their timetables, but also by season. So the very first thing I did was that first shot that you show of the hydro, which was, I better get amongst it. What would be a good reason for starting? I better just start and see what happens, which is really good because I'm a natural control freak, as evidenced by my surroundings. So having to respond is really good for me. So I began that piece of work then, and that was maybe took place over a number of days, but over about 2 weeks they were doing that work. And then the other scientist I worked with, John Howe, he had cruises booked as well. John is a geomorphologist, so he's the other end of the scale. So he was working with sonar mapping, which is, if you imagine somebody takes a scaffolding pole, this is actually what they do, and imagine a torch shining down onto the seabed. And what that torch is actually doing in terms of this technology, sonar mapping, is sending down sound, hence sonar mapping. And when it touches something soft, it sends back a particular note when it touches something hard. So his schedule had to follow his schedule. So his schedule was February, I think. He was the first person to side scan sonar map Loch Linney, which was absolutely fascinating. So it was very responsive, which is totally out of control for me. And what I tend to do is, if in doubt, draw, which I think is nurture, not nature. My training at art college was, I went to art college at a time when you drew, and drawing was in the curriculum, and it was an investigative process. It wasn't an end result. It wasn't, make a cartoon of an image that you'll then make a painting. It was that this is a line of inquiry. So I would do that at the same time. And then anytime there was a vaguest, because you've got to get people in a good mood in these things. So if somebody offered me a piece of kit, like dolphin ear subaquatic microphones, I'm there. I will learn how to do it then and there, because that opportunity with all that goodwill attached will not happen again. So the answer is very responsive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting, I guess a good bit of time has elapsed from when you were there and when the work was first shown at Street Level back, I think it was 2011, Slow Water was first going, yeah. And do you know, did SAMS, did they continue with those residency programs, or was that a bespoke thing for you?
No, they did. I was the first one. I made my one up. So mine was a Leverhulme. And then they had somebody, so it wasn't like Leverhulme would then fund all the other ones, but they got a taste for it. And it's an extraordinary thing, because it's like a little island of super science brains. And it's geek paradise, and I am a geek. So they're very intellectually confident people. Mm-hmm. At the cutting edge of science. So I think to a certain extent, people in the visual arts are, because we have a reputation for being, all about the self-expression and the mess, that would be intolerably annoying. But actually they would pick, because they would do it, they did a long run-in with me, that they would pick people with whom they could have an intelligent, potentially very beneficial conversation. So I think there was a documentary filmmaker after me, and I think they've continued to do them. But you'd go, Creative Scotland might fund something. You may come in, if you're going more down the line of documentary, you may come in with Screen Scotland funding, or you have to align your own ducks. But yes, I believe that they continued after me, and they got a taste for it.
Great. And one of the comments we got during the course of your talk there was just saying that you know, the absolute importance of water to life has become much more crucial in recent years. And they commented that there was a programme on the BBC last night called Ocean Autopsy, a secret story of our seas. So what are your thoughts on that sort of subject matter since making that work back then? I guess given now like COP coming up and environmental issues, I guess maybe being more at the forefront of a lot more people's thinking, and how that sort of the role that plays.
Well, on the level of my own practice, it's been a constant. You know, when somebody points something out to you, you can't shake it. It doesn't necessarily foreground itself. So after this work, I got a bursary funding to go and work on Wilderness, which was a large format, long film of a study of a community and a landscape and how they work together. And two elements of that, well, water is everywhere, as you've just said, but two elements of that that are distinctly part of this is, I worked with a salmon fisherman on slow water, but we haven't got time to go into all that. But one of his pals, since 1966, worked at Torridon in Shieldig, the upper part of Shieldig on the top of Applecross. And he has there's a trout trap there. So what used to be called Freshwater Science, government body, have a trap where they are counting the trout in and counting them out and counting eels and weighing them and things like that. So I worked with him, and I also worked with a prawn fisherman who works in between around Deerbeg and the sort of the muddy banks just before you get to the Sound of Sleat, which you can't actually fish in because it's where they do the underwater submarine torpedo testing stuff. So there's lots of prawns there because nobody's been fishing there. Anyway, in answer to your question, it never goes away. It becomes, it's not annoying. It's like what I say, I mean, I love learning things, and I have my education, my formal education, higher education is 9 years long. So I'm not listening to anybody who tells me to read a book anymore, but I obviously have a hunger to learn these things. So the water, in answer to the observation about this, is it happens at every scale. It's the Bloom thing in Ulysses. It matters all the time. So on Wilderness was about that kind of world. And then subsequently, I've never been able to let go of this sort of aquatic web brain that is always paying attention to it. Not to that this was, this definitely dealt with my interest in terms of a massive, probably 2 or 3 years of my life thinking about it, but it remains a constant. And in terms of the themes, well, one of the things, so I was there 2008 to 9, and they told me about the European Framework Directive, pause to weep quietly, which was, the goal of that was in 2015 to have the waters around Europe in good condition, in good heart. And it wasn't met, needless to say. And then I Googled it the other day because I thought, well, okay, we're no longer in Europe. Have we, there's this logic that there are going to be, going to have our own laws that will replace this. And I just dipped in, and it was like it was going to be a Peely Wally version of that insistence that we clean our waters. Because there are so many forces in operation here. I mean, what on Wilderness taught me, working with the prawn fishermen and the community, and how the community economy works in the Highlands, and quite often portmanteau employment. And you are the postman, but you're also a fisherman, that kind of thing, is that you do need salmon. You do need to go out and fish. And so it's not, the agenda is not an untouched, pristine rewilding. The agenda is to live and work and have a modern life in this landscape where you are a steward of the landscape. So that's, so it's not black and white.
Yeah.
That's a very long answer to a short question.
We've got a question come in from Julie Lang, who asked, did you encounter any overlaps in artistic and scientific research practice? What impact did your work have on those who work in those landscapes?
Overlap, I think, well, definitely, obviously, the aforementioned precision. I think, well, in a formal sense, their imagery is horrid. Really, I kept telling them. They would show me, John, the geomorphologist, would show me these beautiful scans. It's like they mow the water with that torch that goes, and so you get these gorgeous combinations of a photograph, which is kind of X-ray grainy of the seafloor, and then some 0.25, 0.5 lines in black. But they're all about that spectrum, you know, they have spectrum, deeply ugly. So I did rail at them for their imagery. But then they had a division, a guy called Rory McKinnon, who was a brilliant graphics guy. So he knew how to, because you've got to have a public face to science. So I was speaking to everybody, really, who could tolerate me. In terms, intellectually, I didn't discover anything for anybody. I never expected to. But I did, I brought things up or said things because I have permission to say, you know, unsubstantiated things. And I think that they were to do that observation about the fishermen who work on the cruises. We were talking about when you go for scientific funding, you have to have quantifiables. They're not about, in art, you have, the edges are blurred, and you may have quantifiables every now and again, like please let there be enough paintings to go on the wall, but it's definitely not the same world. And I was pointing out that this, you know, somebody should be valuing the fact that you can do this stuff in a storm on a slippery boat with a, you know, with a glass syringe. So it was really valuing the unspoken and unnamed dance of science. And then the other thing was, the gentleman, I'm going to hate myself, his name will appear in my brain in a minute, or on a bit of paper, I'll never find it. There was a great guy who worked in the lab, so when the samples came in, he was the bloke who dyed them and took photographs of them, and he trained me. The photographs in Our Friends and Neighbours are all taken with a camera attached to a microscope, and what the scientists do is they have the sample and they move through different clicks of the focus. And they will take something like 35 photographs at different focal distances, and then the software will amalgamate them so they have this clear in focus image for study. I did 75 because I was riffing on Dutch hyperreal, you know, eye of God precision. So that attention to detail, what some of them really liked because they came to the exhibition, was the insane level of detail and the interest in the minutiae of things. So I would never, I think other people are capable of and are interested in something new. In fact, I think a lot of the residencies that I've seen and a lot of projects I've seen are only new knowledge will come from the collision of, but you know, that's like an awkward marriage, really. And I really I like my own way or the highway. So my residency was always set up with, you know, I'll get on with my business and I want to talk and I want to learn and I can be generous, but I'm not going to solve anything. But there is something, I mean, even at this point now, asking me again to engage with that work helps me a great deal. But also, you know, I was listening to myself and thinking, oh, it's quite a good story, isn't it? It's fascinating. And the idea that Scotland is, the Scottish government is funding, SAMS is also part, it's where you can do the marine science degrees at the University of the Highlands and Islands. Do a plug for that. It's the Scottish government, by funding that, and the UHI by having that there, and those scientists working all over the world, is a world-class institution for learning that has immediate consequences on the coastal edge of Scotland, which will affect prawn fishermen, and it will affect fishing and trawling. You know, it'll just, at some point, somebody's got to draw some conclusions about salmon farms and sea trout lice. Nobody has, but you know, all this stuff is, it's wonderfully quietly, maybe I'm making too much noise about it, it's wonderfully quietly going on, and it's at an international level, quality of knowledge. So I didn't tell them anything they didn't know. I just pointed out a few things about the fact that their pictures were particularly ugly, and I didn't understand why they had to use a spectrum of colours, and that the things that they'd forgotten were skills that they had learnt that were remarkable, were actually things of value which should be celebrated, probably.
Yeah. One of the things that I was really taken with, I remember seeing the exhibition when it was on at Street Level, and it was think I had maybe just started college. It was one of the first exhibitions I'd seen in Street Level in the new space. I know. But revisiting it last week with you, it was really interesting to see the kind of scale that you play with. So these microscopic organisms are, the prints on the wall are the same size as Rannoch Moor, which is, you know, so was that, where was the thinking in that, the kind of the execution of it as an actual exhibition?
Well, scale is relative, isn't it? And I think that it's a sort of Father Ted thing, you know, when they're in the caravan, they're looking at one's near and one's far, one's near and small and the other one's big and far away. It's the idea, because that's knowledge. Okay, I'll go with a long one. There are certain prevailing ideas about human knowledge and perception, about measure. So, for example, the metric system is apparently a consequence of the French Revolution. So we're all working in tens now, because before then, you could have one village that had, there is a point to this, one village that would have a bale of hay, and they would want to sell it. And in their village, they had a particular measuring system. Then they'd go into the town, and the town had a different measuring system, and you'd make less money. So to be egalitarian, to have all being equal, you would have a system. And I think that intellectually, I know that I like paradigm shifts in my own brain. I like thinking that there's not one history, there are many histories. I learned this, I studied with a great bloke in Montreal, Alberto Perez Gomez. He's an architectural historian and theorist and philosopher. And I didn't know any of this stuff beforehand, but one of the things he kept doing was he would put in our way, me and the students, these theories that broke down things that I believed all my life, like progress, the modern idea of progress. We're all going to get better. We're just going to increase knowledge and it's just going to be better. And we're pretty much on a straight line. And he just came in with this, you know, we have periods of knowledge. So in terms of scale, if we get beyond, you should understand a landscape by being above it and seeing it in a map, and then zoom in, and then you're at detail. And that's how we as humans, that's how we discipline ourselves to understand. And one of the things Alberto introduced me to was allowing things to coexist, that knowledge doesn't have to be on a straight path. And this suits my nature much more as well. So a tiny little foraminifera, single-celled organism, well, I was telling you, the brittle star is saving us. You know, we should be encouraging the brittle star, and the brittle star is a tiny little thing. So when I stop thinking in prevailing patterns and models of thought, it's like I'm walking through a meteor shower of possibilities. So the scale thing is a recognition of that, you know, just because it's small, it's not unimportant. And we don't need to, just because we can see from a satellite, that doesn't mean that that's how knowledge should happen. That you always find that satellite's a consequence of the military industrial complex anyway. So somebody somewhere is trying, conspiracy theory, is trying to make me think in a particular way. And after the 9 years at college of being made to think in particular ways, I would like to plough my own furrow. That's why there are a number of different scales.
That's interesting. That's not the answer that I was expecting. I was thinking, when I was looking at the work, I was thinking more, you know, so the microscopic, it just encourages more kind of scrutiny and a real kind of intensity of looking. And that's something that comes across in the films as well, the real kind of quiet, slow, hard looking that you do at the landscape, at the details, the sounds, you know, even just watching those men at work loading the ship. Arguably nothing happens, but so much happens if you really look and spend the time with it. So it's interesting, you know.
But that is, I mean, I think I mentioned it, or maybe I've been thinking about it afterwards. I was thinking, what defines what I do? And it's that I pay attention. I really do pay attention. And if I can shut up at the right points, because I'm a chatty creature, then people start to talk. And it turns out they talk as much as I do if I can just keep quiet. But it is paying attention to everything, really. It's quite exhausting.
No, I think that's a really kind of key thing, paying attention to everything. That's, you know, through the course of the Everything Flows program that we've put together, you know, there's lots of different approaches to the theme of kind of the marine environment and life on the coast and different things, but it's that just paying attention to these little kind of markers. So yeah, it's great. It's great to have your project involved as part of that. We're just about out of time. So I just want to say thank you so much for your really generous talk and taking the time to be with us again tonight. As I say, for those of you at home, if you haven't seen the exhibition, I really strongly encourage it. It's on until the 18th at the Harbour Arts Centre in Irvine, and you can also see the work of Coulson and Tennant as well. So two really strong shows, both at the Harbour Arts Centre, so it's worth a trip down the water. We will be back same time next week, where we'll be joined with John Mayer, former drummer of the Buzzcocks, who will be talking to us about his project Nobody's Home, which is on show as a kind of a window trail around Rothesay. So yeah, if you can join us back for that next week, please do. So all that's left for me to say is thank you once more, Victoria. Thank you everyone watching at home. Yeah, see you soon. Take care, everyone. Thank you. Bye.